My name is Daniel Carter. I'm 34 years old, and 3 hours ago my mother stood in front of 50 members of our family and called me uneducated and worthless. What she didn't know at that moment was that in less than 20 minutes, every executive in the company she worshipped would be standing when I walked into the boardroom, and the look on her face when that happened was something I will never forget. But to understand how we got there, you have to understand one thing about my mother. In her world, education was everything. Not learning, not intelligence, not character. Just degrees, titles, and appearances. If you had the right diploma framed on your wall, she respected you. If you didn't, you were a disappointment. And unfortunately for me, I was the child who didn't follow her script. The dinner that night was held at the Grand Riverside Club, the same place my family hosted almost every important event. Weddings, anniversaries, business celebrations. The kind of place with polished marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and waiters who moved like they were part of a silent ballet. It was supposed to be a celebration. At least that's what the invitation said. Family dinner celebrating the future of Carter Holdings. Carter Holdings was the company my grandfather built from nothing 40 years ago. A logistics and supply chain business that eventually grew into a multi-million-dollar operation. My mother had taken over leadership after my grandfather retired, and for the past decade she treated the company like it was her personal kingdom. And my older brother, Andrew, was the prince she had chosen to inherit the throne. Andrew was everything she admired. Top university, MBA, executive title by the time he was 30. Every time she introduced him to someone, her voice would change. It would become softer, prouder. "This is my son Andrew. He's the vice president at Carter Holdings." When she introduced me, the tone was different. "This is Daniel, just Daniel. No title, no accomplishment worth mentioning." To be fair, the story she told about me wasn't technically wrong. I had dropped out of college when I was 20. I had refused the management trainee program at the family company. And then, a few months later, I packed my car and left home. According to my mother, that decision proved something about me. That I was irresponsible, lazy, a waste of potential. For years, she repeated the same sentence whenever relatives asked about me. Daniel chose the easy life, which was ironic, considering those 10 years were the hardest years of my life. But that part of the story wasn't important to her. When I arrived at the restaurant that evening, the private dining room was already full. Long tables were covered with white linens and silverware that gleamed under the chandelier lights. My cousins were laughing near the bar, my uncles were arguing about golf scores, and several of my mother's business associates were already seated near the front. I spotted Andrew immediately. He was standing beside my mother near the head table, wearing one of his perfectly tailored navy suits, talking confidently with two board members from Carter Holdings. He looked exactly like the future CEO everyone expected him to become. When my mother noticed me, her expression shifted for a brief second. Not warmth, more like mild irritation, as if I had shown up somewhere I didn't quite belong. But she quickly replaced it with a polite smile for the sake of the audience. "Oh, Daniel, you made it." She gave me a quick air kiss on the cheek before turning back to her conversation. Andrew glanced at me and smirked slightly. "Still alive, huh?" "Last time I checked," I said. He chuckled like it was a joke and turned back to the board members. I found an empty seat halfway down the table and sat quietly while the dinner started. For the first hour, everything was normal. Food was served, wine glasses were refilled. People made speeches about the company's growth and the exciting opportunities ahead. Then eventually my mother stood up. She lifted her wine glass, tapping it gently with a spoon. The room slowly fell silent. My mother loved speeches, and she was very good at them. She began talking about my grandfather, about the early years of the company, about the importance of discipline and hard work. Her voice carried easily across the room. Everyone listened. Then her speech slowly shifted toward her favorite topic, success. She gestured toward Andrew proudly. Some people in this family understood the value of education and commitment, she said. Andrew smiled modestly as a few relatives clapped. Then my mother's eyes moved across the room until they landed on me, and suddenly her voice sharpened. Unfortunately, she continued, not everyone made those choices. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. But she didn't stop. Oh, some people decide that rules don't apply to them, that discipline is optional, that education is unnecessary. Then she gave a small, dismissive laugh. And the result of that kind of thinking is exactly what you'd expect. She raised her glass slightly. An uneducated and worthless life. Her gaze stayed locked on me. The message was unmistakable. The room went very quiet. A few relatives avoided eye contact. Andrew leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying the moment. I didn't react. I simply picked up my water glass and took a slow sip. Because in about 15 minutes, we were all going upstairs, to the Carter Holdings boardroom, and my mother had no idea that the meeting she was about to chair was about to introduce the company's new majority owner. And when I walked into that room, everyone would stand up, including her. If you had asked anyone in my family 10 years ago which one of my mother's sons would eventually run Carter Holdings, they would have answered without hesitation. Andrew. Not because he was smarter, not because he worked harder, but because Andrew had always been exactly what my mother wanted. Growing up, our house ran on a very simple rule. If Andrew did something, it was impressive. If I did the same thing, it was expected. And if I failed at anything, it was proof that something was wrong with me. Andrew was 3 years older than me, and from the beginning, my mother treated him like the family's greatest investment. When he got into a prestigious university, she threw a celebration dinner. When he started his MBA program, she told everyone at church. When he joined Carter Holdings straight after graduation, she framed his employee badge like it was a trophy. Meanwhile, my path looked very different. I did well in school. Actually, I did more than well. I graduated high school with grades good enough to get into a respected business program. But the moment I started college, something became painfully clear to me. I didn't want the life my mother had already planned. Every conversation at home revolved around the same thing: the company, the future of Carter Holdings, how Andrew and I would eventually run it together. Except there was never any real question about who would actually be in charge. Andrew would lead, I would assist, and somehow, that future felt like a cage. So halfway through my second year of college, I made a decision that changed everything. I dropped out. When I told my parents, my mother didn't even try to hide her disgust. She stared at me across the kitchen table like I had just thrown my life into the trash. Do you have any idea what you're doing to your future? She asked coldly. I'm choosing my own future, I replied. That sentence made her laugh. Not a warm laugh, a sharp, mocking one. Daniel, she said, shaking her head. People who throw away education don't choose their future. They settle for whatever life gives them. After that conversation, things in our house changed. My mother stopped talking to me like I was her son. She spoke to me like I was a disappointment she had to tolerate. And Andrew? Andrew treated the whole situation like confirmation of something he had always believed. That he was the responsible one, the successful one, the one who deserved everything our family had built. A few months later, my mother offered me what she clearly thought was a generous compromise. She arranged a position for me in Carter Holdings' management trainee program. Since you've already ruined your education, she said bluntly, this is the best opportunity you're going to get. But there was one condition. I would start at the bottom, and Andrew would be my direct supervisor. The message behind that arrangement was obvious. If I wanted a future in the company, I would have to spend the next several years working under my older brother while he climbed the corporate ladder. I thought about it for a week. Then I declined. My mother was furious. Andrew was amused. And 3 weeks later, I packed everything I owned into the trunk of my car and left home. I moved to a tiny apartment in another city and took the first job I could find. It wasn't glamorous. I worked long hours in a small logistics warehouse, managing shipments and inventory schedules. The pay was barely enough to cover rent and groceries, And most days I came home exhausted. But something strange happened during those first few years. For the first time in my life, every decision I made was my own. No expectations, no comparisons, no speeches about what success was supposed to look like. Just work. Hard, relentless work. I learned everything I could about logistics systems, supply chains, and transportation networks. I asked questions constantly. I stayed late to study how operations actually functioned behind the scenes. Eventually, I started noticing problems, inefficiencies, outdated software, broken communication systems between warehouses, and slowly, an idea began forming. A better system. At first, it was just sketches in a notebook. Then it became a small prototype. Then a business plan. 3 years later, with the help of 2 partners who believed in the idea as much as I did, we launched a small logistics technology startup. In the beginning, nobody paid attention. Not the industry, and certainly not my family. As far as my mother was concerned, I had simply disappeared into a life of mediocrity. But while she was proudly introducing Andrew as the future of Carter Holdings, my company was quietly growing. Year after year, client after client, until eventually, 10 years later, we were no longer a small startup. We were a major logistics platform. And a few months ago, an opportunity appeared that was too important to ignore. Carter Holdings had started struggling financially. Poor investments, expensive internal projects, and a leadership team that was far more confident than it was careful. Several large shareholders began selling their stakes. Most people saw it as a warning sign. I saw something else. An opportunity. So quietly, over the course of 6 months, my company started buying shares. Block by block, investor by investor, until 1 week ago, we crossed the line that changed everything. 51% ownership, controlling interest, which meant that tonight's board meeting, the one my mother believed she was hosting, was actually scheduled to introduce the company's new majority shareholder, and my family had absolutely no idea who that was. I finished my drink and looked around the dining room again. My mother was laughing with a group of executives. Andrew was explaining something about strategic expansion to 2 board members. They both looked very confident, very comfortable, very certain about the future. I checked my watch. 10 minutes until the meeting. Soon we would all be heading upstairs. And when that boardroom door opened, their entire understanding of who I was about to collapse. Dinner ended the way most family dinners do, people pushing their chairs back, waiters clearing plates, conversations breaking into smaller circles. Laughter returned to the room as if my mother's speech had been nothing more than harmless humor. But I noticed something interesting. A few relatives kept glancing at me, not with sympathy, with curiosity, because when someone is insulted publicly, people expect a reaction, anger, embarrassment, at least an awkward attempt to defend themselves. I had done none of that. I simply sat there, calm, quiet, watching, and that made people uncomfortable. My mother didn't seem to notice, or maybe she simply didn't care. She stood near the front of the room with Andrew and several executives from Carter Holdings, discussing the board meeting that was scheduled to start upstairs. I walked over to the coffee station and poured myself another glass of water. As I leaned against the table, I could hear fragments of their conversation. The acquisition proposal should stabilize investor confidence, one board member was saying. Andrew nodded confidently. Once the new investor sees our long-term expansion strategy, they'll realize they made the right decision backing this company. My mother smiled proudly beside him. Yes, she said. Carter Holdings has always thrived under strong leadership. The irony of that sentence almost made me laugh. Just then my mother noticed me standing a few steps away. For a brief second, our eyes met. Her expression tightened. She walked toward me slowly, heels clicking across the marble floor. "Daniel," she said quietly, her voice carrying the same tone someone might use with an inconvenient guest. "Yes? The board meeting is about to begin. I know." She folded her arms slightly. "This isn't really the kind of environment you're used to." There it was again. That subtle reminder that I didn't belong. I nodded politely. Understood. She studied my face for a moment, clearly expecting some kind of defensive response. When none came, she continued, "Well, since you're already here, you can come upstairs if you want." I raised an eyebrow. Really? Her lips formed a thin smile. "It might be educational for you." Behind her, Andrew chuckled. "Yeah," he added casually. "You could learn something about how actual companies operate." One of the board members laughed softly. I looked at both of them. Then I nodded. "That sounds interesting." My mother gestured toward the elevators at the far end of the hallway. "We're starting in about 5 minutes." Guests who weren't involved in the meeting began saying their goodbyes, while the executives and board members slowly gathered their documents. Andrew walked past me toward the elevators, adjusting his suit jacket. "You'll probably want to sit in the back," he said over his shoulder. "Try not to interrupt anything." "I wouldn't dream of it," I replied. He smirked and pressed the elevator button. A few moments later, the doors opened, and several of us stepped inside. The ride up to the executive floor took less than 30 seconds, but the atmosphere inside the elevator felt strangely tense. My mother stood near the front, scrolling through notes on her tablet. Andrew was reviewing financial projections. 2 board members quietly discussed investor expectations. No one paid much attention to me, which was exactly how I preferred it. The elevator doors opened to the executive floor, revealing a wide hallway lined with glass offices and dark wooden paneling. At the far end stood the Carter Holdings boardroom. I hadn't been inside that room in more than 10 years. Not since I was a teenager attending one of my grandfather's retirement celebrations. Back then, the boardroom had felt enormous. Now it simply felt familiar. A few assistants were already waiting outside the door, organizing folders and tablets for the directors. One of them opened the boardroom door as we approached. Inside, the long conference table was already surrounded by several board members and legal advisors. Some of them glanced up as we entered. My mother immediately moved toward the head of the table, her usual seat as chairwoman. Andrew took the chair to her right. The other directors settled into their places. I quietly walked toward the far end of the table and sat down in an empty chair near the wall, exactly where Andrew had suggested. The back of the room. From there I could see everyone clearly. My mother tapped her pen against the table. "Let's begin." The quiet conversation stopped instantly. A corporate secretary activated the presentation screen. My mother straightened her posture, slipping naturally into the confident tone she used whenever she addressed the board. "As everyone here knows," she began, "today's meeting includes an important announcement regarding the company's new majority investor." Several directors nodded. Andrew leaned forward slightly, clearly eager. My mother continued, "Over the past several months, Carter Holdings has been in negotiations with a strategic partner interested in acquiring a controlling stake in the company." She paused briefly. "The transaction was finalized last week." A few board members exchanged curious glances. Andrew smiled. "So when do we meet them?" he asked. My mother turned toward the secretary. "They should be arriving any moment now." Right on cue, there was a knock on the door. The secretary stood up and opened it slightly, speaking quietly to someone in the hallway. Then she stepped back inside. "The majority shareholder has arrived." Every person in the room turned toward the door. My mother nodded. "Excellent. Please bring them in." But before the door could open again, I stood up from my chair at the back of the room and began walking toward the head of the table. For a few seconds, no one reacted. Then Andrew frowned. "Daniel," he said, confused. "What are you doing?" I didn't answer. I simply continued walking. And that's when something happened that none of them expected. One by one, every member of the board began to stand. At first, the movement was subtle. One chair slid backward, then another, then another. Within a few seconds, the quiet sound of chairs moving filled the boardroom as one director after another stood up from their seats. Not casually, not slowly, but with the kind of immediate, respectful motion that happens when someone important enters the room. Except no one had entered. The door was still closed. The only person moving was me. I continued walking toward the head of the table, the soft carpet muffling my footsteps. For a moment, my family didn't understand what they were seeing. Andrew looked from the standing board members to me, confusion spreading across his face. Why is everyone... He stopped mid-sentence, because at that exact moment, one of the senior directors spoke. Good afternoon, Mr. Carter. The words hung in the air like a sudden drop in temperature. The entire room went silent. Andrew blinked. Mr. Carter? Slowly, he turned his head toward me, and that was when he noticed something strange. Every executive in the room was looking at me, not casually, not politely, but with the focused attention people give to the person in charge. I reached the head of the table and placed my folder down on the polished wooden surface. My mother was still sitting in the chair that had always belonged to the chairperson. Her hands were frozen on top of her tablet. For the first time since the meeting started, she looked uncertain. Her eyes moved around the room, at the standing directors, at the lawyers, at the executives, then finally back to me. What is this? She asked. No one answered. The company's legal advisor cleared his throat and spoke calmly. Mrs. Carter, the board is acknowledging the arrival of the majority shareholder. My mother frowned. Yes, I understand that. Her voice sharpened slightly. But why are you all standing now? The lawyer hesitated for just a moment. Then he gestured toward me. Because he's already here. My mother turned toward me again. For a brief second, the meaning of those words didn't reach her. Her expression stayed blank. Then confusion appeared. Then disbelief. No, she said slowly. That doesn't make any sense. Andrew let out a short laugh. Wait, are you saying Daniel is the investor? One of the directors answered him calmly. Yes. Andrew's laugh stopped instantly. That's ridiculous. He looked at me like he was waiting for the punchline to a joke. I didn't say anything yet. Instead, I opened the folder I had placed on the table. Inside were the official documents confirming the acquisition. The lawyer stepped forward and slid a copy toward my mother. Last week, he explained, Carter Logistics Group completed the purchase of several major investor blocks. My mother stared at the papers. Her fingers slowly lifted the first page. Her eyes moved across the legal language. Then she turned the page. Then another. The color drained from her face. This isn't possible, she whispered. Andrew leaned over her shoulder, scanning the document. His reaction was more immediate. What the hell is this? The lawyer remained calm. The transaction transferred 51% ownership of Carter Holdings to Carter Logistics Group. Andrew's voice rose. 51%? Yes. That's majority control. Yes. Andrew looked up at me, his expression shifting from disbelief to anger. You're telling me this company bought our shares? I finally spoke. My company, I corrected gently. He stared at me like he had misheard. Your company? Yes. For a moment, no one in the room moved. Then one of the directors said quietly, Mr. Carter is now the majority shareholder and chairman of the board. My mother's chair scraped softly against the floor as she slowly stood up. She looked smaller suddenly, less certain. Her voice came out tight. You're saying my son owns this company? The lawyer shook his head slightly. Technically speaking, he controls the company. That sentence seemed to land like a physical blow. My mother looked at me again, but the expression in her eyes had changed. 15 minutes ago, she had been looking at me like I was an embarrassment. Now she was looking at me like she was trying to solve a puzzle she didn't understand. You dropped out of college, she said quietly. Yes. You left this company. Yes. You disappeared for 10 years. Yes. Her voice sharpened. So how exactly are you standing here as the majority shareholder of Carter Holdings? I closed the folder and met her gaze. You told me something once, I said calmly. The room was completely silent. You said people who throw away education don't choose their future. I paused, then continued. You said they settle for whatever life gives them. My mother didn't respond. She just stared at me, so I finished the sentence for her. I decided not to settle. Around the table, several directors exchanged small smiles. Andrew slammed his hand against the table. This is insane, he pointed at me. You can't just walk in here and take control of our company. I looked at him calmly. I didn't walk in. I tapped the stack of documents on the table. I bought in. The lawyer adjusted his glasses. The acquisition was finalized 7 days ago. All filings are complete. Andrew's voice dropped to a furious whisper. You planned this. I held his gaze. For 6 months, my mother finally spoke again. Her voice sounded different now. Quieter. More fragile. You should have told us. I thought about that for a moment. Then I gave a small shrug. You told me tonight that I should sit quietly and watch how real businesses work. The room remained perfectly still. I've been watching for 10 years. No one said anything. Because in that moment, every person in the boardroom understood something my family had never considered before. The worthless son they had spent years dismissing was now the most powerful person in the room, and the meeting had only just begun. For several long seconds, no one spoke. The silence in the boardroom felt heavy, like the air had suddenly become harder to breathe. My mother was still standing beside her chair. The acquisition documents spread across the table in front of her like evidence she wished would disappear. Andrew was the first one to break the silence. This is ridiculous, he said sharply, looking around the room as if someone would back him up. You're all acting like this is normal. No one responded. That seemed to irritate him even more. He pointed toward me. You can't just show up out of nowhere and take over a company that our family built. I rested my hands lightly on the back of the chair at the head of the table. I didn't take it, I replied calmly. Your investors sold it. That sentence landed harder than anything else I had said so far. Several board members shifted slightly in their seats. Andrew looked stunned. What investors? I glanced toward the lawyer. He opened another folder and began listing the names. Over the past 8 months, he said, 3 major institutional shareholders began reducing their positions in Carter Holdings due to concerns about declining profitability. He slid a set of financial reports across the table. My client purchased those shares. Andrew's face tightened. That's impossible. Our revenue has been strong. The chief financial officer cleared his throat quietly. Revenue has been stable, he corrected carefully. Andrew turned toward him. What's the difference? The CFO hesitated before answering. Profit margins? He tapped the report in front of him. For the past 3 years, operating costs have increased significantly. Andrew looked irritated. That's because we're expanding. The CFO didn't argue, but he didn't look convinced either. I pulled out another report from my folder and slid it toward the center of the table. That's part of the problem, I said. Everyone's attention shifted toward the document. Andrew picked it up first. As his eyes scanned the pages, his expression slowly changed. Confusion, then anger, then something closer to panic. This report is wrong, he said immediately. I shook my head. It's your department's internal numbers. Andrew looked at the first page again. This is taken out of context. I turned slightly toward the board. Page 7. Several directors flipped through the report. On page 7 was a breakdown of a single project that had been draining company resources for nearly 2 years. Andrew's project. A logistics software expansion he had proudly introduced during a board presentation 18 months earlier. At the time, he had described it as the future of Carter Holdings, a revolutionary system that would transform the company's operations. My mother had approved a massive investment into the project almost immediately. I still remembered the speech she gave afterward. This is the kind of innovation that happens when you invest in the right people. Andrew flipped through the pages faster now. The numbers weren't flattering. The project had already consumed millions of dollars, and it still wasn't functional. One of the directors spoke quietly. These losses are significant. Andrew slammed the report shut. This analysis is misleading. I raised an eyebrow. Is it? He glared at me. You're looking at development costs without considering long-term value. That would make sense, I said calmly. If the system actually worked. A few board members exchanged uncomfortable glances. Andrew's voice rose. It does work. The chief technology officer, who had been silent the entire meeting, finally spoke. Not yet. Andrew turned toward him. What does that mean? The CTO sighed slightly. Wake, it means the system still has serious operational failures. The integration with warehouse management software isn't stable. Andrew stared at him. You told me it was almost finished. We hoped it would be. The room grew quiet again. I leaned forward slightly. This project has already lost the company $23 million. My mother looked up sharply. That can't be correct. The CFO slid another sheet toward her. It is. She scanned the numbers slowly. I could see the moment the reality started sinking in. 23 million. Invested in a project that wasn't producing anything. Andrew shook his head angrily. This is temporary. Once the system launches, it won't, the CTO said quietly. Andrew looked at him like he had just been betrayed. What are you talking about? The CTO folded his hands. The system architecture is outdated. Even if we finish development, it won't compete with modern logistics platforms. I didn't say anything, because everyone in the room already understood the implication. Platforms like mine. Andrew turned back toward me, furious. You did this. I almost laughed. I didn't design your software. You're manipulating the board. I shook my head. I'm reading your financial statements. My mother finally spoke again. Her voice sounded strained. What exactly are you proposing? That was the moment the entire room had been waiting for. I looked around the table, at the directors, at the executives, at my brother, then finally at my mother. The project ends today. Andrew's chair scraped loudly against the floor as he stood up. You can't shut down my division. I met his eyes calmly. As majority shareholder and chairman, I paused. I can. The room fell silent again. Andrew looked at my mother desperately. Mom, say something. She didn't. She was still staring at the financial report in front of her. Because for the first time since the meeting started, she realized something terrifying. The company she believed Andrew was strengthening had actually been weakening under his leadership. And the son she had called worthless was now the only person in the room capable of fixing it. For a moment, the boardroom felt frozen. Andrew was still standing beside his chair, breathing hard, his hands pressed flat against the table as if he could physically hold the situation together through sheer force. But the numbers sitting in front of everyone were not opinions. They were facts. $23 million lost, a failing project, and a company that had quietly been drifting towards serious trouble. My mother slowly lowered the financial report back onto the table. Her fingers lingered on the page longer than necessary, like she was hoping the numbers would somehow rearrange themselves if she waited long enough. They didn't. Andrew looked around the table again, desperate now. Everyone knows this project just needs more time, he insisted. Every major innovation goes through setbacks. One of the directors spoke carefully. Andrew, the issue isn't just the setbacks. He tapped the report. It's the scale of the losses. Andrew shook his head. That's short-term thinking. I leaned slightly forward in my chair. No, I said calmly. It's basic risk management. Andrew's eyes snapped toward me. You don't understand this company. I held his gaze. You're right. That seemed to surprise him. Then I continued. I understand the industry. The difference mattered. Andrew opened his mouth to respond, but the chief financial officer spoke first. If this project continues at the current burn rate, he said, the company will lose another $12 million within the next year. That statement landed like a hammer. A few board members immediately began whispering to each other. 12 million more. Even my mother's face tightened at that number. Andrew pointed at the CFO. You're exaggerating. The CFO calmly pushed another document forward. Those projections come from your department. Andrew grabbed the papers, scanning them quickly. His frustration was turning into something more chaotic now. Panic. He turned back to the board. This is exactly why we need strong leadership, he argued. People who believe in long-term strategy. Then he pointed directly at me. Not someone who dropped out of college and disappeared for 10 years. There it was again. The same insult my mother had used earlier. But this time, the room reacted differently. No one laughed. No one nodded. Most of the board members didn't even look at me. They were looking at the numbers. Because in business, reality eventually wins. My mother finally spoke again. Her voice was quieter than before. What exactly are you proposing, Daniel? It was the first time that night she had said my name without sarcasm. I answered simply, we shut down the project immediately. Andrew slammed his hand on the table again. That would destroy 2 years of work. It would stop the bleeding, I replied. That's my division. It's the company's money. Andrew turned toward the board. You can't seriously be considering this. The room was silent. Then one of the senior directors spoke. I think we should vote. Andrew looked stunned. A vote? He turned toward my mother. Mom? She didn't respond immediately. For most of her life, she had controlled every decision inside Carter Holdings. The board usually supported her without question. But things were different now, because the balance of power had already changed, and she knew it. Finally, she looked up. Her voice sounded tired. Very well. She straightened slightly and addressed the room. All those in favor of suspending the project pending financial review. One by one, hands began to rise. First 2 directors, then 3, then 4. Andrew stared in disbelief as the majority of the board slowly raised their hands. The vote was already clear, but they weren't finished. The final hand that rose belonged to the chairman. Mine. Andrew turned toward me, his face pale. You're destroying everything. I shook my head slightly. I'm fixing it. The secretary recorded the result. The motion passes. Andrew's shoulders sagged. Just like that, 2 years of his leadership disappeared in a single vote. But the meeting wasn't over yet. I looked toward the CFO. Next item. He hesitated. There is one more issue. Andrew closed his eyes briefly. What now? The CFO cleared his throat. Because the project has been shut down, the executive position overseeing it will also need to be reviewed. The meaning of that sentence was obvious. Andrew understood it immediately. His head snapped up. You're not firing me. I leaned back in the chair slowly. No. For a brief second, relief flickered across his face. Then I finished the sentence. The board will decide that. Several directors exchanged quiet glances. Because everyone in the room now understood something very clearly. Andrew had just lost the project that defined his entire career. And the person who now controlled the company was the brother he had mocked his entire life. The meeting ended 20 minutes later. Not with applause, not with celebration, just the quiet sound of folders closing and chairs sliding back across the carpet. One by one, the directors stood up and began leaving the room. Some of them nodded politely to me as they passed, offering the kind of professional respect that came naturally once power was clear. A few of them even shook my hand. Good decision today, one director said quietly. Another added, the company needed this. I thanked them politely. Across the table, Andrew hadn't moved. He was still sitting in his chair, staring at the table like he was trying to understand how everything had collapsed so quickly. The confident executive from earlier that evening was gone. In his place sat someone who had just realized that the position he believed was guaranteed had never really belonged to him. Eventually, he stood up without saying a word and walked out of the room. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at our mother. He just left. That left only 2 people in the boardroom, my mother and me. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. The room that had been filled with voices and arguments only minutes earlier now felt strangely quiet. My mother slowly gathered the documents in front of her, stacking them neatly as if organizing the papers could somehow restore control over the situation. Finally, she said something. You planned this. Her voice wasn't angry. It sounded tired. I closed my folder. Yes. She looked up at me. For how long? 6 months. Her eyes searched my face, like she was looking for signs of the sun she thought she understood. But the person sitting across from her wasn't the same person who had left home 10 years earlier. You bought the shares quietly, she said. Yes. You waited for the board meeting. Yes. And you let me humiliate you at dinner. That one made me pause for a second. I didn't let you, I said calmly. You chose to. She held my gaze. For a moment I thought she might argue, but she didn't. Instead, she leaned back slowly in her chair. When did this happen? She asked quietly. When did what happen? When did you become? She gestured vaguely around the room. This? I thought about the question for a moment. Then I answered honestly. The day I stopped trying to prove something to you. That seemed to land deeper than anything else I had said that evening. She looked down at the table again. You should have told me what you were building. I gave a small shrug. Would you have listened? She didn't answer, because we both knew the truth. 10 years ago, if I had told her I was starting a logistics technology company, she would have laughed the same way she laughed when I dropped out of college. In her mind, success only looked one way. A framed degree, a corporate title, a predictable path. Everything else looked like failure. After a long silence, she spoke again. You embarrassed me tonight. There it was. Not regret, not an apology, just wounded pride. I stood up from my chair and gathered my folder. No, I said quietly. You embarrassed yourself. Her eyes lifted toward me. You spent years telling everyone I was worthless. I slid the folder under my arm. Tonight, I just showed up to work. For the first time since the meeting began. She didn't have an answer. She just watched me. And suddenly she looked older than she had earlier that evening. Not physically, but in a way that happens when someone realizes the world no longer revolves around them. I walked toward the door. My hand was already on the handle when she spoke one last time. Daniel. I paused but didn't turn around. Yes? Her voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. Are you going to fire your brother? That question hung in the room for a moment. I considered it carefully. Then I answered honestly, that depends on what the board decides. I opened the door, but if he wants to stay, I added, he'll have to prove he deserves it. I stepped into the hallway. Behind me, the boardroom door closed softly. For most of my life, that room had been a place where decisions about my future were made without me. But tonight, something had finally changed. Not because I had taken revenge, not because I had humiliated anyone, but because for the first time, the people who had always dismissed me had finally been forced to see me clearly. And the truth was simple. The worthless son my mother loved to talk about was the one who had just saved her company.